And so, yeah, this is the Plenty of Room podcast, our maiden voyage episode here. I'm Nate. I live in Rosendale. Uh, Andrew, who are you? Why are you
I'm
here?
Andrew. I also live in Rosendale,
Yeah,
and
well,
I
actually,
guess together we, have done some advocacy here in the neighborhood to increase housing density and a bunch of other fun stuff that we think will really benefit the neighborhood and the city as a whole.
yeah, I guess I need to put my cards on the table. I own a window cleaning company, so I'm in the pocket of the big glass lobby, so I want to see a lot more buildings there, so I get more
Right.
business. So that's my vested interest here. Yeah, so I think what we'll do is we're going to kind of tackle a couple of articles or topics anytime we record, and we'll just unpack it a little bit and discuss it. So it's going to be pretty heavily focused on Boston or Boston area housing and transit stuff. But there'll be some times where we talk about kind of broader topics or things that affect the state as well. Part of the reason we focus on Boston is because the laws are such that Boston kind of has to do all of its own zoning. Statewide zoning doesn't impact us, so a lot of people probably heard about the MBTA Communities Act. That doesn't touch us, so we have to do our own thing here. So I guess the first topic I was thinking of was actually a place I just drove by a couple times today. Is the Poor Clare's project, which so there's a monastery kind of near the border of JP and Rosendale. It's also on the border of the Arboretum, which is important. Come back to that. So it was occupied for I don't know 80 years, 100 years by the Poor Clare sisters, and they had wanted to move out of the space because their numbers were dwindling. I think there's only like 10 active members at this point, and they wanted to move to Westwood. So actually, they're already out in Westwood, and they're trying to sell their property, and they had lined up a developer that was going to turn it into, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, it's going to be something like 123 housing units. I think it was mostly senior housing. There was a good chunk of that was going to be affordable as well. And the kind of key thing that became a major sticking point in this is they were going to go from three stories to four. And so that and some other changes resulted in a pretty. It got kind of stuck in the process, and I think they've been trying to move this thing for about 5 years at this point. And it almost looked like it was dead in the water, and then the Boston Globe kind of revived this about a month ago, and they wrote about this kind of saga that's going on because the nuns are left in limbo. They're not able to sell the parcel and move on with the next chapter of their monastery's life until this thing gets resolved. So, I think that the things that are really important to think about with this is that the major reason this thing is stuck is due to opposition from the Arboretum's leadership, and the kind of key things that they cite are shadows affecting magnolia trees, and also what they're calling viewsheds. That is like what it looks like looking from within the arboretum out of it. And honestly, I think that's kind of the major thing as it comes up. I honestly feel like a lot of the stuff around shadows is a pretext, and the major focus is really on what it looks like from within the park. And this is the thing that just kind of, all right, now I'm going to just like riff on this a little bit because this is the part that personally bothers me a lot. This is a jewel of a park. It's a half mile from my house. I feel extremely lucky to be near there, and I think things that are that beautiful should be able to be enjoyed by many, many people. And the best way you can ensure that's going to happen is by having more housing near places like this. It also happens to be situated in a major American city. And the idea that we should not like the idea of that the view line would be dotted with buildings and you would see those from within the park as thing is almost like polluting your view. I don't agree with that at all. I don't stand in the middle of Central Park and see skyscrapers around me and be like, man, this would be so much better if it weren't for all these pesky skyscrapers. It actually adds to how special that place feels. So I just like fundamentally disagree with the idea that this whole viewshed thing, it feels like a really squishy term, and it's like they're trying to like put an objective veneer on. Really, it's just like an aesthetic preference not to see buildings from within the park. And so I'd really disagree with that. And I think it's a really important one to hammer away on because it also comes up in other places around the perimeter of the Arboretum, because there's a couple of projects on Washington Street. One is on Washington Street currently, and the Arboretum's trying to get them to knock a floor off of that. And then there was a project on Arboretum Road that, at the very least, the Arboretum wasn't helpful in seeing that project go forward. And that's, as far as I can tell, is on ice, or at least indefinitely paused, in part because of concerns around shadows and view sheds. And so this is going to keep coming up until it gets resolved. And I think, I think there's growing pressure from some residents of the city, at least, to say, listen, this is ridiculous. We've got to be able to build some housing around here. It's a perfect place to put it. First of all, let's not forget that it's like a half mile from the Forest Hills T stop. So talk about accessible to public transit, and like being in a place where the need for automobile storage and cars is actually less there than it would be in a lot of other places in the city. This is like exactly the kind of place where you want to be building more, and so it really frustrates me to see these things kind of stuck. I'll add one last note, which is that the Arboretum reached out to my neighborhood association. I'm on the board of the Longfellow Area Neighborhood Association. They reached out to us last year, asked us to oppose this project. And at the time, I remember like reading through the shadow study that they had requested of the developer, and the developer had done. And they actually did it, I think, over 3 or 4 different times of the year to show what the cast shadows would be. And it was, it looked fine. I didn't have I obviously am an untrained eye, but I'm like, how damaging is this going to be? Maybe does it require some replantings? Sure, there's going to be trade-offs here, but it's also like it's not a huge deal. And I actually just seemed like it was totally something that could be worked within. And I thought that the Arboretum's demands were completely unreasonable. I also didn't really like that they were reaching out to us to ask us to object to a project. And I felt proud to be part of a group that refused to do that, because actually there was majority support among the board members at the time when they heard like about the project and more of the specifics. They're like, yeah, we're not signing on to this. Like, this actually seems like a reasonable project to put. It's needed for the community. So, all right, I've been ranting for a bit, Andrew. What other color or comments or questions you have about it?
No, I think it's a great point. I think, in a more rational society, right, the burden of proof would be on the Arboretum to, present its case in a more tangible way of how this would cause, some kind of damage or negative impact on, their operations, on public ability to enjoy the space relative to the benefits, right? I think it basically seems like, hey, we're the Arboretum, so of course we know what we're talking about. And we don't have to really, show our work. And again, just similar to you, it's like, okay, so some parts of the Arboretum are going to get some additional shadows at some times of the year. I don't know what that means in terms of, how things would grow. And certainly I agree with you that the idea that being reminded of a city that I'm in a city while I'm in a city, piece of land is not something that it really makes a lot of sense to me. I know it's a talking point that people come up with, and I think it's emblematic of the larger problem that we have here, which is, a tenant. Something that somebody told me a long time ago that's always stuck with me is it's really never hard to come up with a reason not to do something, right? Like, you can always come up with an excuse to not do something, and we've basically allowed the ability for anybody to come forward and make a case for why something shouldn't happen to have an outsized weight. And it really takes a high burden to demonstrate the benefits of something to outweigh any one person's hypothetical opposition. So if it was just the Arboretum thing, right, like there would be like this Poor Clare's monastery. If it was just like a one-off instance, it probably wouldn't be worthy of us talking about it as much as it is right now. But like, I mean, it's so emblematic of the kinds of problems that we have here, and it does feel especially pertinent, because of all the things you're saying about this being the perfect location, an opportunity for it to benefit disproportionately communities, through the form of it being higher rate of affordability than what is normally required, of it servicing, predominantly seniors, and again, it being this church that is looking to relocate it all adds up and makes a lot of sense, unless you just want to take essentially one person at their word. And it's hard to know, is this just flexing negotiating muscles, or are there actual tangible concerns here that, again, you and I may not be able to understand. But I do think a higher level of burden should be put on presenting that, to control what they're going to do outside of the land that they own and manage, right, at the Arboretum.
Yeah.
If it's going to have an impact, like, I'd like to know what that is specifically, to help make an informed decision if we're going to oppose something from a city level.
A couple of other thoughts. One is, I guess, I imagine we may have like dozens of people listen to this at some point, maybe, fingers crossed. But like, if one of them happens to be Ned Friedman, the Arboretum director, welcome to come on the podcast and talk to us
Yeah,
about
that's
this.
right.
Because like, I have strong opinions about this, but like, I've never talked to him. I haven't. I'm sure he's laid out his case in public in some places, but I haven't heard it. So I don't want to misrepresent any things he's brought up. But but to that point though, and actually, it's kind of a question about this too, because part of me, our friend Alan has also brought up a number of times in relation to the Arboretum, is like, well, who is the Arboretum? So like, like Ned is the voice, the official voice of the Arboretum publicly. And he and the chief of staff have publicly issued statements either expressing concerns about view sheds and shadows. But to the Alan's understanding and mine too, knowing several people who work at the Arboretum, is like, that is not the majority opinion of people who work at the Arboretum. Most of the people are not on board with the Arboretum's opposition to this, and actually think that this is a great project and that they're overestimating the impacts that this might have on the plant life in there. And so, I guess this gets to the point of like, yes, you need leadership that can represent the actual voice of like an institution thing, but like, is it appropriate for one voice to represent what may be a very small minority opinion among the people who actually work there? Should the voices or opinions of the rest of the staff count for something here? I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that, but that's just something that kind of irks me a little bit. It's that like, we're talking about the Arboretum as if this is like a monolithic entity, but at least based on my understanding, talking to people who know a lot of people there as well, that's not most people actually are in favor of this who work there.
No, I think that also lines up with kind of my understanding, the things that I hear. And again, it's like, how much, even if it was right, if 100% of the employees of the Arboretum and its board and everybody was against this, again, like, how much weight should that have, and how do we measure that against the potential benefits and the opportunity cost of not doing it, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it's not just one project but multiple, and when it's setting a precedent, and potentially impacting land use, not just around the Arboretum but the Emerald Necklace, other parks, like, and again, places that are genuinely great amenities that anybody in Boston is fortunate to live near, and places where housing does exist, right? And even sometimes tall structures, and there are tall structures that you can see from the Arboretum already. So again, what is the opportunity cost here, and how can we get specifically decision makers, right? Obviously, it'd be great to get everybody to think about these things, but definitely the people who have decision making power and decide who gets to have how much say. How do we get them to factor those things in? Because obviously, we're living in a city that has surging cost of living problems, with mass exodus of a lot of residents who would like to continue living here but can't afford to. And we're seeing the impact that's having, not just in terms of who lives here, but also in terms of the business activity, in terms of just, does it feel like a thriving, alive city or not? Employment opportunities, all sorts of things. And again, that's like a real tangible cost, but it somehow doesn't seem like it gets weighted appropriately versus, again, the opinion of one institution.
Yeah, and also I just think one of the things that I haven't heard the Arboretum talk about this, but let's like weigh the environmental trade-offs here. Like if it's obviously in to the benefit of the Arboretum, I'm sure the Arboretum considers itself like an environmentally focused organization. Um, there is no better argument than increasing the density in cities for reducing our carbon footprint. Like if you want to actually have people live more efficiently, be less dependent on energy generally, but as fossil fuels specifically, like you want them living in cities. You want them living near transit. It's better for them to be near parks. The air's going to be cleaner and things like that. And I think that we have things backwards when we're always looking at, we want to like thin out the density right around parks. I'm like, I actually want it built up right there so you maximize the access to these things. And I think that
Yeah,
there's,
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, like people just treat it like it's their backyard. Like a lot of times it's just treated like a backyard to a single family home. Like, I don't think that that's appropriate. I think we should have apartment buildings, at least low rise to mid rise apartment buildings around most of these things, because we should be maximizing the access to these things. And I think that's super important. Um, yeah, I don't know. Anything else to talk about with this particular piece?
No, I mean, I think I just wanted to echo your point there. I mean, I think just speaking personally, I spend a good amount of my time in Frederick Law Olmsted parks on a bike, right? So whether that's riding through the Arboretum to get to the Emerald Necklace, to get to Brookline, and lots of other places, and that's a real privilege, and I recognize I'm in a fortunate situation to be afforded to live in a place like that. But to your point, like I think we should increase the opportunities and the number of seats, so to speak, in the game of musical chairs that is housing in Boston, so that more people can have that opportunity. And again, it incentivizes that many more people, because for every person that moves out of Boston and moves further out, that's one more person that is probably consuming more fossil fuels. That's probably emitting more, and dedicating more of their time to their commute, usually by car. So the opportunity to incentivize more people to live car light or travel without a car is a huge component of this. And again, I think from an environmental standpoint, is so critical. And again, it goes back to that, like what are the trade-offs and the opportunity costs here, and why doesn't that get to be more centered in the discussion?
Yeah. All right. Should we shift to the next piece?
You got it.
All right. Second piece is community input is bad, actually, which is a piece that Jerusalem Dempsis wrote for The Atlantic back in 2022. There's two main arguments that she's making about this, which is that input is really bad because community input isn't representative of the local population, and that the perception of who counts as being part of an affected community basically includes anyone who could feel any of the negative costs associated with the project, and only a fragment of the beneficiaries. There's like a math problem there. So the first thing is that community input's not representative. This is something that has been found. There was a book called Neighborhood Defenders that researchers at BU put out several years back that looked at who participates in like community planning and zoning processes, and they found it's not going to be a surprise to anyone who's participated in any of these. It's overwhelmingly homeowners, college educated white families typically are the people who it's really over indexed to that group. And, a lot less renters and people of color tend to participate in these things. And so the thing about, and one of the reactions to stuff like that, having just gone through Squares and Streets, actually,
Right.
was that the city's plan was, let's do more of it. Let's actually double down and do actually more community engagement. We'll meet everyone where they are. We'll go into ball fields and things like that. We'll talk to people on the street. Super well intended, but it creates the same problem where it almost feels like it's a part-time job to participate in this process, and it's exhausting. And so when you do that, it creates this thing called like the paradox of empowerment, which is like the more you ask of people and to empower them, like the less representative you're going to be. And so you get this very thin slice of not representative views in the community they're actually participating in this process. That's kind of the main, kind of one of the key points about this. So just coming out of Squares and Streets, which is the local rezoning in Rosendale Square, and it's actually they're doing a few other neighborhoods in the city. One of the things that we had talked about, and Rosendale's wrapped up in July of 2025, I think was when ours finished finally, after about a year and a half process. And this is like a third of a mile dot that was rezoned.
Yeah.
Lots of meetings. I can't even count how many meetings we participated to do in that. And one of the things that we were talking about with some members of the planning department afterwards, like, yeah, one way they get more representative sample of the population is have fewer meetings, and maybe instead you do something like, I think they even floated this idea. You get a create almost like a what used to be called an IAG. I can't even remember what that is for. That's like for large
Impact
projects.
advisory group.
Yeah, it's like a community advisory group, and so and it's like selected from different swaths of the population and area, and these are people who they also get stipended, and they offer
Yeah.
childcare for people doing this, and then they actually get some training in basic planning and zoning knowledge, so that they can have like really effective participation in the conversations about this. So you almost get like you get a representative sample. It's a smaller sample of people, but you're going to get actually better, broader input. And you're not going to tire everybody out in the community by having endless meetings that everyone has to go to at 6 o'clock on a school night. So that
Right.
was like one of the recommendations. You were going to chime in there?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I mean, that was our experience to the T. I mean, I think we saw the same, oftentimes a lot of the same people at these same meetings, and I think it's safe to say it was predominantly wealthier, predominantly white homeowners, a mix of either retirement age folks that probably have more spare time, and just sickos like you and me that were just like
Yeah.
willing to make the commitment and had really nice partners who would help, the day to day life stuff while we were spending our time in these meetings.
Yeah.
And I very much appreciated a lot of aspects of the process in terms of getting to engage directly with the planning department and the professionals. I feel like I learned a lot. I'm in an urban planning program now, and a large part is going through that process and the things I learned. But I did not feel like it was conducive to getting a true picture of the general sentiment of the community. So I think something like what you're talking about is absolutely more appropriate. I have to imagine that would make certain folks who frankly, there were individuals that tried to take over these meetings that the planning department was facilitating on a regular basis, and I imagine those people would be even more frustrated if they were felt like they were being excluded from whatever these kind of impact advisory groups were. That would just be radical idea, but just regular folks in the neighborhood. So I think that's got to be a part of why it hasn't happened. Doesn't make it not a good idea. But I think one thing you said is so critical is like the education piece, right? Because I think one of the challenges of engagement is they're trying to find out what the residents want and what the public is looking for, what their wants and needs are, what their concerns are, and then translate that through what they know and understand to make something better for the community as a whole that meets those wants and needs truly, right? Everybody wants, the average person in Boston might say, I really wish that there was more parking, right? And so in their mind, that supports something like, hey, we should have parking minimums for every new unit of construction, right? Because we're generating parking. And then, if you are able to educate to somebody, it'd be like, well, here's what the costs are, and here's what that would do to what your neighborhood would look like. And here's the types of buildings that you love and associate with your neighborhood, like your triple decker. Well, that can't exist anymore. You can't build new ones. Once you educate people on those things, they modulate their opinion and they start to think about, okay, like what am I really looking for? Well, what I'm really looking for is be able to get to work and move around the city day to day in a way that isn't as stressful as my current situation, right? So I think being able to educate people on some of these basics of zoning, so that way they can be an informed participant in the process, is so critical. And again, it's just the way that it's typically been done is not conducive to that. I do want to shout out a great book by Veronica Davis called Inclusive Transportation. That's obviously about transportation policy, which is related to housing policy. And I think in both cases, right, community engagement is very similar. And she makes a great point that, like, it's not just because engagement might be bad or the public process currently might be bad and not producing good results, it doesn't mean the solution is less engagement, it's better engagement. I think that's what we're talking about here. And
Yeah.
I do think that, like, the engagement is like a critical component about it, but I do think at the end of the day, it's like you're never going to get consensus, um, whether it's housing, whether it's transportation. So you ultimately need decision makers who are knowledgeable, who understand the big picture, have this information from their constituents about what their wants, needs, and concerns are, even if they're somewhat polarized, even if they're somewhat what's the word I'm looking for? Like they they counter each other. I want more housing, somebody else wants less. So somebody has to take all that information and
Yeah.
use their convictions and their knowledge and have the courage to make policy decisions that are going to lead to a good result in the future. And ultimately, the politicians and the people that they put on their staff that answer to them are going to be beholden to the public in that avenue by virtue of, are the results good or not, and are we going to keep voting these people in, is how it should work, as opposed to, again, this kind of status quo of the same 30 people show up to the same dozen meetings, and then people are one way or another navigating how to get these campaigns right. We did a lot of outreach to folks that we knew were in the neighborhood who felt very passionate that they would align with a lot of the ideas within Squares and Streets, who are generally on board with higher housing density, who generally don't commute to work solely by car or don't buy groceries solely with their car. People who are on board with these ideas.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's organic. Like, I don't think that what we did, in terms of like getting out to those people, like, would I rather it just be a system where it's like you were saying, like a representative sample within the community? Absolutely. But those are folks that are often too busy, have too much going on in their own life, and frankly don't want to spend their 6 o'clock on a Tuesday in a 2-hour PowerPoint presentation. Or if they do, they want to do it once and not 8 times. So,
Well, and let's just point out too, like it can be extremely unpleasant to participate in these things. I think that's
right.
another really important thing, is that like I never enjoyed going to any of those meetings. It was almost felt like taking medicine, like bad tasting medicine. Cause there's like, yeah, people talking over one another. Most of them were perfectly civil, but it's like, it's not fun to stand up in a room where, yeah, maybe a third of the people like strongly disagree with what you're saying. And you're actually concerned whether they're going to try to cut you off at some point, like that does happen. So
No,
it's
yeah.
like, it takes and if you haven't done this before, like there's a huge disincentive to actually participate in that thing for the first time. So I just want to put that out there too. Like that screens out a lot of people who may actually be interested in participating otherwise, because it's just not that fun to do.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely not. And it's like, I think you and I have, I mean, here we're doing a podcast about it, right? So we have a little bit of strengthening our convictions, and maybe a little bit more motivated to get into the weeds in this than the average person, even if that average person might agree with us. But yeah, no, I mean, I have vivid memories of like just saying on a Zoom call, using I statements, bringing my point of view on why I supported the program, and like, seeing nodding heads, but also seeing like disgusted neighbors. I mean, people who I know, I see around town, or like I know them from X, Y, or Z, like looking appalled and shaking their head and being like, like, this isn't fun. Like, I don't want I don't want to have that memory of that person, and I don't want them to just look at me and just see the guy that is ruining the neighborhood in their mind or whatever. But
Yeah.
some of that just is, and I'll give a lot of credit to the neighborhood. I think with just a couple of exceptions, most people were very civil, and I know a
Yeah.
lot of people who I have great relationships with of all ages and demographics in the neighborhood who may have agreed or disagreed. Business owners who I'm still happy to go in and see them and stuff. So it was overall like, I probably have more of a glass half full, but I definitely don't think it's how this stuff is supposed to work. And I definitely think it's why we're moving at a pace that's way too slow to address what is the single most pressing issue for the neighborhood, the city, the region. It's the thing
Yeah.
everybody talks about, and we're in this crappy situation where it seems like getting anybody in a position of power to take any kind of meaningful action on it feels like rolling a boulder uphill, with some exceptions, right? I mean, we obviously have some allies in City Hall, at the City Council, at least at this point in time,
Yep.
and I do want to just say how much we appreciate that. But this is a strong mayor city, and until we have a mayor that wants to take this challenge seriously, the problem's just going to get worse.
Or the current mayor could take it seriously. That's my hope, right? Is that
Well,
like, I'd like to see that shift. Well, I want to kind of, because what I want to, that I wanted to segue into like talking about the second major point that Demps has brought up, which is that The second one is that, yeah, community process and input is not representative, and there's a whole host of reasons. One of the reasons being that there's just too much that's being required of people without, like, yeah, really consideration that people have lives and stuff like that. So like there's better ways to get a more broadly representative input in the process. But the second part is that we are playing this game at the wrong level consistently.
Right.
And this is actually where I like my strongest disagreement with the administration's approach on this is, which is like, I don't like hyper local zoning. I consider what we did in Rosendale, rezoning a third of a mile circle, maybe, third to half a mile, to be, and then spending a year and a half on that, what was supposed to be, I think was originally envisioned to be like a 6 to 9 month process. To be fair, like that, those things tend to go longer than you think, but it was like more than double what they originally thought it would be. And none of the other three neighborhoods that started around the same time of us have even finished theirs yet. Hyde Park might be close to the finish line. They just introduced their zoning map, 8 months after ours. They started the exact same time. So it's like, it's excruciatingly slow when you do these things at the hyper local level. And also, it's been really demonstrated that the more you focus things at the hyper local level, there's just the NIMBY impulse is stronger. And like, NIMBY gets used as like, not in my backyard, gets used like pejoratively all the time. I like mean that literally, like, because that's actually what most NIMBYs believe. They actually do support more housing. They just don't want it right here. And the thing is, the more you make those decisions at the local level, at the street, like the small neighborhood level, the more that NIMBY impulse really comes to the fore. And so what happens is when you're making decision making for a very small area and you're really focusing on the people who live in that area to make the decision, people have a stronger reaction about losing things. Like, there's loss aversion is stronger than the sense of what you might gain of doing something good. And so it's like really easy to rally people around saving the neighborhood than it is about getting people to envision what the future might be. But just because of basic human psychology, we don't like losing stuff. And a lot of people believe that it will fundamentally change the character of the neighborhood. I will point out, we have had our zoning for a year. We haven't had many shovels hit the ground yet. So it's much more, it's a much more glacial process than I think a lot of people expect. But the other thing is that a lot of the people who would benefit from those things, they're not even here yet because we haven't built the housing for them. So they don't get to participate in this process. They don't get a vote. And so, one of the things that I took from our friend Matt, who's on the Walk Up Rosendale board, is like, he always says, like, I don't say how long I've been in the neighborhood. I don't believe that I have like any, more right or to live, to this neighborhood than someone who's only been here a couple of years because I've been here for like 20 or something like that. And I actually really take that to heart because part of why some people have only been here for a year or not here at all is because they haven't been able to move here yet. Maybe they've been trying, and I think they should have a vote or their voice should be counted. So the more we're doing this stuff at the very small level, the more that people's reactions about stuff happening right next door to them overrides any sense that, okay, there's a bigger problem to solve here, which is that the housing crisis it's not a Rosendale problem. It's not a Boston problem. It's a regional and national problem. And so we should be upping the layer at which these decisions are being made. If stuff like this is being decided at a citywide level, or even like half the city, like just a higher level of city, people's more like pro-housing impulses are going to come more to the fore, in part because they feel like the burden is being shared by other places in the city. And actually, I want to turn over to you because I thought that was a really great point that you brought up at the end of Squares and Streets in Razi, which is like, this is great. We can't be the only ones to do this because then it just puts an unfair burden on a lot of development pressure on Razi because no one else is opening up their doors to new development.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And yeah, it's absolutely, I mean, that was the key reason why I wanted to get so on board with it and be a positive force in favor of it, because I don't disagree with you about like, it's not how I would go about doing the zoning either. But I guess in my mind, and the city has laid out a couple dozen neighborhoods that they see potential for doing this in. And I think at the beginning of the process, that seemed more likely. So it was like, hey, if we can show that there are people, and because we know that there are, because we are them and we're friends with them, and it's the people that we, see around and get involved with different civic groups with. If we can show that there are people in all these neighborhoods that are for this and put some real positive, be the first ones to raise our hands and say yes in our backyard. Then hopefully the city will take that as a sign of good faith to continue the momentum going forward. And that's why it's been really, really challenging. And I voiced some frustration earlier about this administration, and I'll just reiterate it. It feels kind of like a betrayal that they haven't moved this forward in more places. And while I think Roslindale and the city as a whole will still benefit from it, even if they didn't do squares and streets in one more neighborhood, I do think it makes us vulnerable to become, you look at the situation in East Boston, right? Like, I mean, people there feel like they've been really impacted by development. And while I think that's a nuanced topic, they're not wrong that it's happened there disproportionately to what's happened in places like Rossi and other neighborhoods around the city. So it's not that I am worried about like I don't think overdevelopment is a concern here at all, at least from how I look at things. But I do think the only way we're going to solve this problem is if we're substantially upzoning across the board here, and just like Cambridge is taken has the courage and the guts to do it. Like we owe it to them to do our point, to do our share. And then we can look at communities like Milton and say, hey, you guys have this mandate from the state, you need to come through, and all these other
I
places. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess that part of I think part of the point that resonates with me though about doing stuff at a higher level, at citywide level, is it doesn't actually take as much courage as I think people think. Like, look at
Right.
the 20 because I actually think when you do it at the neighborhood level, like the sub neighborhood level, that's where you get like it gets much more drawn out and much more heated, the process actually. And then when you do it at a higher level and it's basically affecting everyone equally, there's a lot of potential for it not to be as controversial. Like, take into account in 2021 there was a citywide zoning change that made it no longer a requirement that affordable housing developments in the city provide off-street parking. That was a zoning change that affected all new affordable housing developments in the city. How much like, it comes up in maybe individual projects occasionally because some abutters will say, hey, we want more parking there. Well, they can't force them to do it, but overall, most people probably aren't even aware that it happened. And
Right.
that's been on the books for 5 years now. So it wasn't hugely controversial. I mean, it's possible it was more at the time than I'm recalling, but like it doesn't, in retrospect, it certainly doesn't feel like it was a hugely controversial change, but it was meaningful and it affected
Right.
everybody equally. I feel like this sense of fairness is important. That's why I like doing stuff at a higher level, because it affects everyone equally. And so I think that there's certainly not all things should be done at the citywide level, but much more of this game should be done at it, both because it strikes at the issue of fairness. It also, it kind of gets beyond letting our kind of like hyper local NIMBY impulses overwhelming our desire to actually see the housing crisis solved. It allows that broader goal of actually supporting more housing everywhere to actually come to the fore and make their decision, and allows us to move a heck of a lot faster. We're getting leapfrogged by cities, not just in Massachusetts, but around the country in terms of like removing barriers to getting more stuff built that's actually affordable for people. So
Right.
anyways, that's kind of some of my main thoughts on that piece, because I just thought that was it's a banger, and I think about it all the time, especially when we're talking about stuff at the sub neighborhood level. It's like, man, I wish we could just knock this up a layer, just another level or two.
No, I agree, and I think the more that you shrink the pool of people that are being considered as being impacted, it's kind of like the more you're excluding other people, that are the secondary and tertiary impacts, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not just people that live within Roslindale Square and that third of a mile dot, and it's not just the people in the neighborhood. It's people across the city that are going to be impacted by these decisions, or if the city had not moved forward with it, the lack of a decision. Um, so again, I think it's just like it's human nature to want to kind of like decide who's in and who's out, but I think that mindset is what's gotten us into this situation, and I think until we can start thinking bigger picture and recognize, that we don't own public spaces the way that maybe we think we do, until we can do that, we're going to have a lot of these problems.
So, man, you have any pieces you wanted to cover today?
No, I mean, I think this is a great start. I think if anybody's listening and has topics that they'd like to hear discussed, if they
Yeah.
want to throw their hat in the ring and join, we definitely, we're working on mapping out a couple of different episodes and topics, but I think we want to keep the perspectives as varied and diverse as possible. So again, if you have an angle, if there's a topic you want to talk about, either we're happy to discuss it, or we're happy to have folks on. But yeah, I think this has just been a good conversation. And Ned, if you're listening, come on the pod.
And made it to the end. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining for the plenty of room podcast. I should know the name by now. I guess hopefully we'll see you for episode 2.
All
Take it
right.
easy.
Till then, neighbors.
Yeah.